So there's a report that says that businesses may have to source funds alternatively, have to look for alternative sources of fund as banks faces tighter liquidity issue. It's become not very easy for businesses to access loans from banks, particularly the deposit money banks, commercial banks, because of the procedures. The high interest rate is also there, and the credit reserve ratio too is also another issue, which means that the bank also has to retain much of its cash within the banking system. But I worry about businesses being able to source funds from alternative sources. That might just also increase the cost of capital for them. Now, if from the banking system or from the financial system, getting loans means that you get to access loans at around 30 or over 30%, because if the MPR, the interest rate, is 27.5%, so imagine the banks adding their own interest to it, what you get at the end of the day, and the bottlenecks, the demand for collateral, and sometimes business plan. If you are a new, if you're a new entrepreneur, you're someone who's developing a business and you want the bank to put in money. So you may not pass through all of that processes when you try to source funds from alternative means, but the interest rate might just be so high that putting that kind of money into business means that prices of goods and services too might increase.
First of all, I want to congratulate those men, those women that are doing business in Nigeria. It's a very strong terrain, because the cost of doing business itself, by the time the cost of doing your business, you make calculations and you begin to factor in some of the things that enables your business. For example, if you are into manufacturing, in Nigeria, you know that one of the factors of production that you should have, you need power, and the overhead for power alone is a cutthroat. So if you're looking at that and you are going to do that, you are going to try to look at power, technical skills, to make sure you have technical hands who can operate the machines that you will have, and looking at other personnel that should govern and the goods that you'll be manufacturing and running the organization is much of can be very, very demanding. So I want to give kudos to that. However, though we were told that because of liquidity, the cash liquidity in the banks have been tightened, so businesses now need to look elsewhere. There are some businesses that they will not even birth and hire. They will have access to loans, even from the same banks that may not want to give out loans. Now, these businesses that have to do with food production, now food sales or the fast food, because of the nature. So banks are going to be looking at the nature of the business and the rate of turnover that this business will be generating before they can give out those loans. So if your kind of business are not the kind of businesses that suit the everyday needs of Nigerians, and they feel they look at your records and your turnover is not something that is very, very convincing, and they can see the tendencies, because banks do not just send personnel to come and look at your books. They are equally themselves businessmen and investors, and they can tell by just looking at the records, which will give the banks another hand to want to to negotiate. So let's assume the businesses that are coming, their turnovers are well. In fact, there are some businesses that banks go to. They are asking the business owners that we have loans available for you to come and take. And some of them too can involve agriculturists, and those who are into farming, large-scale farming, those who are into production of staple food that Nigerians cannot, but they have to have access to it. They always have those loans. So for the alternative sources, without banks, where else are they going to go? Person to person?
There are companies that are into lending, money lending.
And those ones will not fall under the threshold of 27.5%.
That's what I'm saying. So higher cost of borrowing for the businesses.
that in itself, it's going to have a toll on the business environment and employment, and in fact, it's even going to have a toll even on the same cash liquidity that we are talking about, for which the banks are crying out for. So an alternative would be that the same measure where the president, when he came out and he said he's going to be removing fuel subsidy, and when Nigerians cried, he came out to say, okay, for nano businesses, we're going to give out a loan. And for a few of those small kind of businesses, I think about that specific point in time, the president was talking about information coming out from the presidency. Then we're talking about 75 billion for nano businesses and 50 billion as well for MSMEs. So I think those specific loans that we are talking about that should be coming from the government should not only be coming at a time when we are dealing with a crisis, when we are dealing with economic crisis. This in itself is an economic form of crisis that government should intervene. And whilst I was looking through a business day yesterday, I looked at how the Lagos State Ministry of is it Lagos State Ministry of Finance or Lagos State Ministry of Economic Development was talking about. I'm trying to get the specific name of the ministry itself. It was talking about how it has doled out lots of money to small businesses. I'm not talking about the issue of 50 million small businesses that came out the other day, and we're having a conversation. This is too much. I don't think Lagos alone have that. But they were talking about how much hundreds of millions of naira that they've doled out to small or medium-sized businesses that are doing extremely well
as
in
grants
Lagos
or
State,
as loans?
As loans.
Okay.
As loans. And a few of them as grants, non-payable in Lagos, and how those ones are performing to the optimal. So I think not only Lagos State, we should begin to have other state governors and other wealthy individuals. We know of Tolu Elumelu, who through his foundation gives out $5,000. But sometimes I just hope and I just wish that, can we have a Nigerian version for just Nigerians? Because that specific
it's open.
It's open.
Broad.
It's very
that's
broad,
why
and not only Nigerians.
It's meant to be a survival of the fittest kind of thing.
Yes. So I am looking for one for the well-to-do Nigerians, like in the class of the Tony Limelus, the Dangotes.
To have their street
just for Nigerians alone, irrespective of where you are from, for Nigerians alone. In that specific case, we could be dealing with issues like this for small businesses or businesses that can only function if they have access to loan. And now that the banks are going through some form of liquidity stretch, then it could be an alternative for these small businesses, to latch on, to thrive, and to sustain operations.
All right, let's look at what the decision of the last MPC meeting, what were the outcomes of the decision. So interest rate was put at 27.5%, cash reserve ratio was put at 50%, and then liquidity ratio was put at 30%. That's not too bad, but if you look at the bank itself, it seems that they're even doing way less than what the CBN states in terms of cash reserve ratio and in terms of liquidity ratio as well. So if we're talking about the banks facing higher liquidity challenges, if you even go to the bank, and this started like during the U-turn, you want to withdraw a certain amount of money, you're told, oh, we don't have cash, this is as much as we can give to you. And sometimes people worry like, what's happening? And you think maybe it's just a seasonal thing, it's because of the festive season, maybe it's the CBN's way of actually controlling inflation, trying to ensure that there's not too much money in circulation. But that time passes out. This is already the first quarter of the year ending, but it's still well obvious that there is some challenges with liquidity in the banking system. Now, why is there liquidity issue? Is it that the banks are having a lot of bad loans? Could that be one of the reasons? If there are bad loans, why do we have bad loans? Yeah, bad loans could happen when those who took the loans have not been able to repay the loans or not service the loan as at when due. There's also the issue of insider borrowing. Are we having more of that? You remember the CBN actually raised that issue and sanctioned some banks for that. Are we having issues of insider loans as now a challenge for banks. Could that be the reason? Now, if that is the reason, then CBN needs to do a lot more to check insider borrowing so that it does not become a challenge for the banks. Now, for that of the banks not even having cash, it's another challenge. So I know that the CBN just came up with a policy to disincentivize the use of cash. So when you go over to ATMs, you have to pay more now for withdrawing. But that is also affecting the banking system, because now people are beginning to think, why should I put my money in the bank when it takes a whole lot, or it costs me so much more to withdraw that money from the bank? So it's as if there's an informal financial system where the cash just is outside of the banking system. So people are trading with the cash. I have money, I have cash, I do not want to let go of the cash. I find a way to sell the cash so that I can get some transfer. You know, it's just happening, and it's now reducing the level at which the banks themselves will have cash. But that is not as worrisome as the issue of bad loans, which could be making it difficult for banks to have enough liquidity to loan. Because when banks don't have enough money, how then do you loan? Interest rate is high, there's not enough liquidity. So that means that it becomes it becomes very difficult for banks to give out loans. Where they would have been able to give loans out maybe to 50 businesses, now they are more constrained. So the measures will be more strict. It will be very, very difficult for businesses to access loans. And if they turn to alternative sources, chances are that the interest rates are going to be way higher. And that's going to be problematic for the businesses, even for the collateral that they would need to present in order to secure the loans. And the patience level, you know, for banks, there's a time frame they give to you to pay. Now, for the other alternative sources, they also give a time frame. But, you know, with banks, sometimes you can restructure. You can do some renegotiation when loans are not performing. But how much of that option of flexibility is allowed within alternative sources of fund for businesses is what I really cannot ascertain. But what I would recommend here is that at the next NPC meeting, the CBN should perhaps look at some of these decisions. So for the interest rate, I think the CBN should reduce it. I know they didn't do that at the last NPC because the rebasing had just been done then, and it seemed like it was still quite early in the year. Prices were beginning to drop, so CBN was still watching to see what would be the outcome after the rebasing of the economy has been done. But I expect that at the next NPC meeting, the CBN should reduce the interest, the MPR, even if it's just by
a fraction.
Yes, yes. Even if it's just by 200 basis points, let's have some reduction. That may be like that may give a sigh of relief to give some form of relief to businesses. And then for the cash reserve, I think that it can also be reduced so that the banks don't have to keep too much money, because right now it's at par. The bank has to give out as much as it keeps. So I think that the banks should be encouraged to give out more so that they have more funds to give out. And then for liquidity ratio, that should also change so that let the CBN use its own instrument to handle some of those challenges.
I wish they can listen to you.
It's really a wish. It's really a wish.
But the thing is, you know, one of the reasons I want to think if it could be one of the reasons why the CBN maintained the NPR when they came by 27.5%. So you were saying the reason why they did that because the economy was just being rebased.
At least I think that's the most logical explanation.
But if you remember vividly, during that period, the cash for crude deal with local refinery was still in operation.
Yes.
The Port Harcourt refinery was around picking up, even though not up to 50 or 60% thereabout. The Warri refinery itself and a few other refineries, you know, they've picked up because the NNPCL was supplying them crude for naira, even though the naira was almost the same value with how much they would have bought it in the dollar. But however, it suppressed the 40% pressure that it had on the naira. So it became it had its own significant, though little, benefit on the Nigerian economy, and since we're beginning to stabilize a little, we had a marginal reduction in food sale, in the prices of food stuff. There was a marginal reduction Nigeria will begin to secure here and there in the economy. And these are beginning to create a stable platform where we felt the nation will begin to thrive. But now that the Naira for crude policy, it doesn't look as if we are still guaranteed under that platform. The next time the NPR or the MPC is going to be sitting, I don't really guarantee they are going to take your decision, Blessing. I don't think they are going to want to go down a fraction or even maintain the 27.
Why do you think so?
Because all these marginal achievements that we've recorded the few months' time will be erased completely when this Naira for crude deal is completely nullified.
So do you think that interest rate is going to be increased?
By the time it is nullified and we start purchasing, they start importing fuel, local refiners, the price might jump up. And when the price jump up in that, it's going, remember it's fuel,
yes,
it's going to affect
inflation
food.
Rate is going to increase, of course.
Thank you very much. Inflation rate is going to run, and what's the measure that the MPC will use to tackle the inflation rate? Is to increase the borrowing rate.
You see that measure, it hasn't worked. Far.
That's the instrument they always will.
No, I think at this point, if the CBN can even have some unconventional or unorthodox method to control inflation, it should do so, because the conventional method has not worked. Okay, so the CBN uses the increase of interest rates to try to control inflation, emphasis on try, because so far it hasn't worked. To try to control inflation, because
working for them.
The assumption is that the inflation is demand-based. So they think there's too much money in circulation, let's mop up by increasing interest rates. But the reality of it is that there isn't actually enough money in circulation, and it's not as a result of demand either, because the purchasing power of Nigerians is reducing by the day. So it cannot actually be demand a push. It's actually cost push. Things are more expensive. The prices of goods and services increase almost on a daily. It's just for this first quarter that we seem to have seen some form of stability. Yes. But like you said, now once once March ends, when the Naira for crude agreement terminates, and then Dangote Refinery have already announced that it's not going to be selling petroleum products with Naira, because it will be a mismatch for them, currency mismatch. They can't be buying crude in dollars and selling petroleum products in Naira. So it has to be on a level playing field where they buy in dollars and they also sell in dollars. So that means that the pressure on the forex market is going to increase. You have a lot of people sourcing forex in the market. You have petroleum importers sourcing forex. You have refineries sourcing forex, and you have other businesses sourcing forex in the forex market. So what that means is that the Naira is going to depreciate further against the dollar. And being an import-dependent nation, we're going to see the prices of goods and services increase. Inflation is going to increase. And if inflation is increasing, you are increasing interest rates. What that also means is that you are further increasing the inflation rate, because businesses that are having loans or taking loans at a higher rate would pass on that cost of funds to the consumers, further increasing the inflation. So this method that the CBN has been employing so far has not worked. But let's take a look at this on the flip side, or if we have to reverse the method. If the CBN reduces interest rates, now while the forex market is experiencing or would experience some scarcity because there's now more demand than supply, yes, prices will increase, but it will not increase so much because the businesses are not obtaining funds at a very high cost. So that gives some relief to the businesses. But if we want to go by what is written in the textbook and use it, our situation is peculiar, is different from what the textbook considered when they prescribed those economic principles. So I think that it should not be that way of saying, oh, inflation rate has increased again, so let's increase, because it's actually not working. Let's look at what obtains in other climes, for the US and even for Eurozone. So when inflation was increasing, they did actually increase interest rates. But even their own inflation was single digit interest rates. It wasn't even double digits, not even up to 10. For Eurozone, it was around 2%. For US, it was about 5%, and then it started declining. But for us, we're dealing with inflation rates as high as 34%. Even before we got to 34%, at the time we were around 28 or so, they were still increasing interest rates. So it doesn't make any sense. Even in other climes, they've begun to reduce interest rates. So why would we, if countries that are having single-digit interest rates, single-digit inflation rate rather, are reducing interest rate, does it make sense that a country that is having double-digit inflation rates should be increasing interest rates? So I think that the CBN needs to consider some of these things at the next NPC meeting.
Okay, so let's even assume that the inflation is a cost push. So what are they even supposed to do? Reduce the interest rate.
Yes.
So that people can have access to money and purchase these goods.
Yes.
Because in that particular sense, you'll be strengthening the purchasing power
Yes.
of not just the man, but equally the businesses.
Because they have to make inputs, buy raw materials, pay for services too.
Okay. But in that specific case, because it is being almost like a norm, using that method, like you said, to treat inflation, when are we going to just change it? When are we going to just change it? Now, they've spoken about Mr. Olayemi Cardoso and his bright ideas, innovative ideas of trying to sanitize the whole system. Recently, we're talking about how they used a very, very transparent means in appointing the board of directors or directors in the CBN, and how through PricewaterhouseCoopers and another non-organization, they use transparency to select those who should occupy their different positions in the CBN, and they are people from within the system, and the organization that was consulted, they were within the system. So the system is to an extent well sanitized. So when we look at that, do we have a template that we should begin to look at when all this financial crisis or economic crisis erupt? And if we do have templates, what's the goal? What's the end point? Is it to salvage the strength, the purchasing power of that? Do we even look at the purchasing power of the Nigerian? Do we even look at the tendency of businesses to survive? Do we even look at how we should sustain any little or marginal gains that we have made in time past, whether it is 6 months, whether it is 3 months?
You see
because
that,
if we don't have all those goals in place,
touched is very critical, how to sustain marginal gains or progress made. So because we have policy inconsistency or policy somersault, we're unable to sustain gains. Take, for instance, the Naira for crude deal. So within that period, the 6-month period from October 2024 to March 2025, when the Naira for crude deal happened, we saw the progress that was made. So there was petrol availability, the prices was fluctuating based on market forces. So we saw a sort of competition between Dangote Refinery and the NNPCL because of that arrangement. So in 6 months' time, we could say there was marginal gains. Now, because there's a renegotiation, which doesn't look like it's going to happen at the end of the day, that deal is extended, which temporarily Dangote has reverted to, let's use dollars, since the NNPC now is saying, let's buy with dollars. So we can't be buying with dollars and selling with Naira. We'll be at a loss here. Let's go back to the dollarized petroleum industry. So what that would do, even if it's for another 3 months or another 6 months, because NNPC actually came up to say when there was a report that they had suspended the sales. They said they weren't suspending the Naira for crude, they were renegotiating it.
Yes.
So, but details of that renegotiation are not available at the moment. But what that would do, since we're going back to what was before, the scarcity of forex that we're going to see happen, the potential increase in the price of petroleum product, potential because they might be increased because of the difference in exchange rate, they might not be increased. Now, all of that, we water down the gains made so far. If a renegotiation happens and maybe after another 6 months, we come back to that naira for crude, we'll find out that we are coming back to where we left before. So it's like taking one step forward and 2 steps back. We can't sustain the gains. So until we maintain that consistency in policy, that's how we can even evaluate to know the impact of the policies. And it gives a wrong signal as well to foreign investors. Because when you have inconsistencies, businesses cannot plan long term. And you need that long-term plan for businesses to be able to map out strategy that will ensure stability and progress.
So, in fact, let me take us back to the objective again, this liquidity, strangulating liquidity about the banks and how businesses need to source alternatives. From what we learned from basic education and basic economics, we were taught that CBN, being the regulatory authority, has the right to tell commercial banks on the aspect of the economy to focus loans to. If the CBN is actually using that instrument, and as a regulatory authority, if it is actually using eagle eyes to look at the banks, if they have given in those sort of instruction to the bank, let's assume, from henceforth or in the next 3 years or in the next 2 years, to the deposit money banks or to the commercial banks, look, we should be focusing our loans to agriculture sector. We should be focusing our loans to power, to renewable energy. When we start talking about individual investment in that sector, we should be focusing our loans to tech startups or focusing our loans to education. And when they give out those instructions and those action punchlines because of the regulatory power they have to banks, do the banks obey that? Do they listen to such instructions? Do they go out with such instructions? Because from what we learned or what happened during what is popularly called as the Emefiele era, yes, where the CBN, is talking to the deposit money banks, and we could see the deposit money banks, will I say they were presenting an alternative to the CBN, or there was this quote-unquote rebellion or contention with the CBN, and like, no, we cannot do this. This money, and this is also a legal tender. Both of these go together, and there was this sort of confusion among Nigerians. We need to make sure that the CBN stands on its footing regarding its regulatory authority and its powers, and when it's given out, it's not something that will be turned down by the commercial banks.
Okay, now to wrap up, I'll just say that I think the CBN needs to put to do more monitoring of the deposit banks' activities. Yes, somebody may say, but there are other banks. There is the microfinance banks. Yes, the microfinance banks, from what we saw last year, actually happen to be lending more to businesses. But you know that their strength is not as much as the deposit money banks because of their own limitation and the segments of businesses they are supposed to cater to. They're supposed to cater to SMEs. But for the deposit money banks, I think that the CBN should do more of monitoring, because if you look at the liquidity ratio, 30% is fair, and that's quite healthy. But even if at that level, at 30%, the banks are still facing liquidity challenges, then the CBN needs to check what's actually going on. Because when we talk about liquidity ratio, it's actually the time it takes for the banks to convert their assets to cash and to take care of liabilities or debts or whatever. So if the banks seem to be having more liabilities or seem to be having challenge to convert their assets in short term, quickly to cash, so what's actually going on in the banking system? So before it becomes a very, very serious problem, we think that the banks, the CBN rather, should monitor a lot what is going on in the banking sector.